Your backyard is alive. A dozen sparrows hop between the branches of the old oak near the fence. A pair of cardinals work through the sunflower seeds you put out this morning. A woodpecker hammers away somewhere behind the garage, steady and rhythmic, like a tiny heartbeat in the trees. Then the sky changes, not slowly, not with any obvious warning. One moment everything is fine. Birds everywhere, the air full of motion and sound. And then something shifts. The light goes flat. The wind drops completely. And the birds stop. First, the sparrows leave. Then the cardinals. Then the woodpecker goes quiet mid-strike. You look around and the yard is completely empty. Not a single bird in sight. No feathers, no sound, no movement. You look up. Dark clouds are rolling in from the west. A storm is coming. Maybe 20 minutes out, maybe 30. But the birds knew. They knew before the first drop of rain, before the first rumble of thunder, before your phone buzzed with a weather alert. Where did they go? How do creatures that weigh less than a handful of coins survive something powerful enough to snap branches and flood streets? And why, and after decades of watching birds, do so few people actually know the answer? What you're about to find out isn't just surprising, it's one of the most extraordinary survival stories in the natural world. And by the end of this video, you will never look at a disappearing bird the same way again. Scientists and birdwatchers have been trying to answer this question for a long time. For most of human history, bird behavior during storms was treated as folklore, something your grandmother noticed, something farmers read as a sign of bad weather coming. It wasn't taken seriously as science. But over the last several decades, researchers using radar tracking, acoustic monitoring, and careful field observation have started to unravel exactly what birds do when severe weather approaches. And what they found was far more sophisticated than anyone expected. This video is going to show you the full picture. Where birds actually go when storms hit. How they detect those storms long before any human technology does. The secret behaviors that almost nobody notices, even when they're happening right in front of us. And the single most impressive survival strategy in the entire story. One that puts into perspective just how remarkable these animals truly are. But to understand where birds go, you first have to understand something even more fascinating: how they know the storm is coming in the first place. Imagine you had a sense that worked like a barometer built directly into your body. Not a device you carry, not an app you check. A physical sensor wired into your nervous system that registers the slightest drop in atmospheric pressure, the kind of drop that happens hours before a storm arrives. That's what birds have. The inner ear of most bird species contains a structure so sensitive to pressure changes that researchers have compared it to a precision instrument. When a storm system moves in, it pushes changes in air pressure ahead of it. Changes so subtle that humans can't feel them at all. Birds feel them almost immediately, but pressure is just the beginning. Birds also respond to infrasound, sound frequencies so low that human ears can't detect them. Thunderstorms, large storm systems, even wind patterns over mountains generate infrasound that travels hundreds of miles ahead of the actual weather. Scientists studying golden-winged warblers in Tennessee found that the birds abandoned their breeding sites a full day before a massive tornado outbreak reached them, flying hundreds of miles south to avoid it. When researchers looked at what triggered the departure, they found the birds had likely detected infrasound from the storm system still far away. Think about that. A 4-inch bird weighing less than half an ounce detecting a storm from hundreds of miles away and making the decision to evacuate, not when the storm hit, not when the clouds appeared, but a full day before any of it arrived. And that's not all. Birds also pay close attention to wind, not just wind speed, wind direction, wind consistency, and the way wind feels when it starts to behave differently than usual. Experienced birdwatchers have noticed for generations that bird activity spikes dramatically right before a storm as birds rush to feed, rush to drink, and rush to move. It looks almost frantic, because in a way it is. The birds are preparing, they know what's coming, and the fact that they know it so far in advance is what makes the disappearing act possible, because what happens next is something most people miss entirely. Here's what a storm actually looks like from a bird's perspective. Long before the clouds arrive, hours before the sky changes, before the wind picks up, before any of the usual warning signs humans recognize, birds begin quietly shifting their behavior. The feeding gets more intense. They're putting in calories because they may not eat again for a while. The social dynamics loosen. Birds that would normally compete for the same branch suddenly seem less interested in territory and more interested in moving. And then at some point that looks almost random to a human observer. They start to go. They don't all leave at once, it's more subtle than that. The open field birds go first, the ones perched on fence posts, hopping across lawns, picking through gravel driveways. They drift toward tree lines, toward hedges, toward the edges of things. If you're watching your backyard feeder, you might notice a slow thinning. Fewer birds, fewer visits, longer gaps between arrivals. Then the understory birds begin consolidating. They move deeper into shrubs, push further into tangles of brush, find the thickest cover they can within their home range. They're not fleeing in a dramatic rush. They're quietly repositioning. And then, usually well before the first drop of rain, they stop moving almost entirely. This is the moment people notice. The yard is empty. The feeder is abandoned. The neighborhood has gone completely quiet in a way that feels almost wrong. You might look out the window and think the birds have vanished, but they haven't vanished. They're closer than you think. They're just invisible now, tucked into places that most people walk past every day without ever looking inside. And when you find out exactly where they are, you'll realize how brilliant the whole system is. Picture the thickest, densest shrub in your neighborhood, not an ornamental bush trimmed into a neat ball. The wild one, the overgrown hawthorn at the edge of the park, the tangled mass of multiflora rose in the corner of the field, the ancient forsythia that nobody has pruned in 15 years and has turned into a shoulder-high tangle of arching stems. That is a storm shelter. And it might be sheltering dozens of birds right now. Inside a dense shrub during a severe storm, the conditions are radically different from what's happening outside. Wind speed drops dramatically within just a few inches of penetrating the outer layer of branches. Rain doesn't reach the inner branches directly. It drips down from layer to layer, losing force. Temperature is more stable. And perhaps most importantly, the structural complexity of the shrub's interior gives a small bird dozens of options for wedging itself into a position where the wind can't dislodge it. Birds grip branches with a locking mechanism in their feet, a tendon arrangement that tightens automatically when they bend their legs, meaning they can literally lock themselves to a branch while asleep or in a storm without conscious effort. Tucked deep in a shrub, locked onto a thick inner branch, a sparrow can ride out a violent thunderstorm with far more stability than seems possible. But shrubs are just the most accessible shelter. Some birds go further. Cavity nesters, woodpeckers, chickadees, nuthatches, owls have a significant advantage during severe weather. A hollow in a tree, even a small one, offers protection that no open perch can match. Researchers studying black-capped chickadees found that during severe winter storms, the birds used cavities not just to roost at night, but specifically as emergency shelters during daytime storms. They would enter the cavity, go almost completely still, and wait. The inside of a tree hollow buffers temperature, blocks wind, and provides structural protection. For a bird that weighs 11 grams, a 6-inch deep cavity might as well be a bunker. And then there are the ground birds. Species like white-throated sparrows and dark-eyed juncos who find shelter in a completely different dimension. Dense leaf litter, fallen logs, root tangles under old trees. These birds press into the ground-level landscape and disappear. They become part of the ground cover itself. You could walk within 3 feet of a huddled junco during a severe thunderstorm and never know it was there. But what about the birds that don't have access to classic shelter? What about species with different strategies, different bodies, different relationships to storms? Because some of them do something that seems almost impossible. Not every bird responds to storms the same way, and when you start looking at the individual strategies, the variety is almost overwhelming. Small songbirds, your sparrows, finches, warblers, mostly follow the shelter-seeking pattern. But even within that group, there are differences. Larger sparrows can handle more wind exposure than tiny warblers. Species that breed in areas with frequent severe weather tend to have more refined storm behaviors than those from calmer climates. Corvids, crows, ravens, jays are a different story entirely. These are birds with significant cognitive flexibility, and it shows in how they handle storms. Crows in particular have been observed doing something remarkable. They sometimes continue flying during moderate storms, apparently adjusting their flight technique to use the wind rather than fight it. A crow riding a storm gust looks almost playful, banking, tilting, using the air currents in ways that seem deliberate. Whether this is truly play or simply opportunistic behavior, it demonstrates a level of physical control that smaller birds simply can't match. Woodpeckers have an obvious advantage. Those cavities they spend so much time excavating serve them especially well when severe weather hits. A pileated woodpecker's nest cavity goes deep into a tree trunk, sometimes 12 inches or more, and the thermal mass of the surrounding wood keeps the interior surprisingly warm and calm even in violent storms. They don't just escape to cavities. They escape to cavities they built, engineered to specific dimensions in specific tree species facing specific directions. And then there are the hummingbirds. A ruby-throated hummingbird weighs 3 grams. Its heart beats over 1,000 times a minute during normal activity. It burns through energy so fast that it regularly approaches starvation simply by getting through a single night. So what does a hummingbird do when a severe storm cuts off its access to flowers and insects for 12 or 18 hours? It does something that sounds like science fiction, and it's the piece of this story that changes everything. The word is torpor, and once you understand it, you'll realize that birds aren't just surviving storms, they're doing something far more sophisticated. Torpor is a state of dramatically reduced metabolic activity. Body temperature drops, heart rate plummets, breathing slows to a fraction of normal. The bird enters what is essentially a controlled near shutdown, burning almost no energy, generating almost no heat, becoming almost completely still. Hummingbirds do this every night as a matter of survival. Because their metabolic demands are so extreme, they can't maintain full body temperature through a cold night without running out of fuel. So they drop into torpor, let their body temperature fall close to ambient air temperature, and essentially pause until morning. They wake up looking almost dead, chilled, motionless, barely responsive, and then, over the course of 20 to 30 minutes, slowly rev back up to full operation. During a severe storm, this same mechanism becomes an emergency survival tool. A hummingbird deep in torpor in a sheltered spot burns almost nothing. It can survive a long storm with almost no energy expenditure. When the storm passes and flowers are accessible again, it wakes up and resumes its life. But hummingbirds aren't the only birds that use something like torpor. Common porwills, a nightjar species found across western North America, are the only birds known to enter true hibernation-like torpor for extended periods. During cold snaps or food shortages, they can go weeks in a deeply torpid state, essentially suspended. Other small birds, while not entering full torpor, significantly reduce their metabolic rate and body temperature during cold, wet storms, a strategy called regulated hypothermia. The savings in energy can be enough to tip the balance between survival and starvation during an extended period of bad weather. And there's another behavior that's just as remarkable, and it happens in the spaces between shelter and torpor. When temperatures drop during a severe storm, many small birds will cluster together in tight roosting groups, sometimes pressing body to body in a cavity or dense shrub. Researchers measuring temperature inside these huddled groups have found that the center of the cluster can be significantly warmer than the outside air. The birds on the outside rotate toward the center over time. It's a communal heating system, individual sacrifice for collective survival. And it works. But all of this, every strategy we've talked about, assumes the storm is something the birds can wait out where they are. And sometimes a storm comes along that changes that equation entirely. On April 27, 2011, a tornado outbreak swept across the southeastern United States. Over the course of 16 hours, more than 200 tornadoes touched down across Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, and neighboring states. It was one of the most destructive weather events in American history. Among the casualties were thousands of birds, but among the survivors was something that nobody expected, or at least not in the numbers that appeared. In the days after the outbreak, birdwatchers along the Gulf Coast and across the Central Flyway began reporting unusual species showing up far outside their normal range. Birds that should have been breeding in Tennessee were appearing in coastal Louisiana. Species that migrate through the mid-continent showed up on the Atlantic coast. The tornado outbreak had, in effect, scrambled hundreds of miles of migratory routes, displacing birds that had been in the wrong place when the storm system moved through. This kind of displacement, ornithologists call it weather displacement or sometimes storm petrel drift when it happens at sea, is one of the most reliable ways birdwatchers find rare species. After major hurricanes, the interior of the continent sometimes fills with oceanic birds that have been carried hundreds of miles inland by the storm's circulation. After nor'easters, European species occasionally appear along the northeastern coast, blown across the Atlantic on massive wind systems. Hurricane Hugo in 1989 deposited least terns and other coastal species into the interior southeast, hundreds of miles from the ocean. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 displaced entire colonies of nesting seabirds. After Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico in 2017, the island's bird populations took years to recover, not just because of habitat destruction, but because entire communities of birds were scattered, some never returning. And yet birds survive hurricanes. Birds survive the tornado outbreak of 2011. Birds survive nor'easters that dump 3 feet of snow. Birds survive ice storms that encase every branch in an inch of glass. Some of them don't make it. Some of them are lost, but the species endure, the populations recover, the songs come back. Because the thing that birds have going for them isn't just a set of behaviors, it isn't just good instincts or lucky shelter choices, it's something that goes much, much deeper than that. Here's what all of this really means. We tend to look at birds the way we look at most small animals, as delicate things, fragile things, things that need protecting. A bird in a thunderstorm seems almost pitiable, all that feathers and hollow bones against wind and rain and lightning. But that's exactly backwards. What birds have developed over the course of roughly 150 million years of evolution is a set of survival tools so refined, so layered, so precisely calibrated to the threats they face that they leave our own storm preparedness looking primitive by comparison. We check weather apps, we close windows, we stay inside. They feel the infrasound of a storm system before it has even formed into coherent weather. They read the atmospheric pressure like a story being told hours in advance. They communicate urgency to each other in ways we haven't fully decoded. They find shelter that looks like nothing from the outside and functions like a fortress. They alter their own physiology, dropping body temperature, slowing their hearts, dimming the lights of their metabolism, to survive conditions that would kill them if they simply tried to endure. And when all of that fails, when the storm is too big and too violent and too fast, many of them simply move. They pour themselves into the wind and find somewhere else to be, sometimes hundreds of miles away, and they start over. The fact that this system sometimes breaks down is stated that the birds die in storms, that populations get hammered by hurricanes, doesn't diminish it. It contextualizes it. The birds that survive are the ones passing on those refined instincts to the next generation. The birds that disappear before the storm hits are the ones whose descendants will fill your yard next spring. The next time you look out the window and the yard is empty and the sky is going dark and the air smells like rain, you won't wonder where the birds went. You'll know. They're tucked into the thick hawthorn at the edge of the park, pressed body to body on a sheltered branch, waiting it out with a patience and a precision that has been developing since before our species existed. They're not hiding from the storm, they're outlasting it. And they've been doing it for 150 million years longer than we have. Have you ever noticed birds disappearing right before a storm? Maybe a sudden silence in your backyard, or a feeder that went completely empty before the first raindrop fell? Tell us about it in the comments. We read every single one.